Blackened Earth is a 5-part adventure supplement for the Warhammer Age of Sigmar Soulbound tabletop role-playing game, all of which is published by Cubicle 7 and licensed from Games Workshop of Warhammer fame. This is something like the 7th or 8th supplement that Cubicle 7 has put out for Soulbound. I reviewed the original core rulebook in another video. If you're not familiar with the game, it's basically the licensed RPG of the Age of Sigmar war game, and from a gameplay perspective, it departs from the old Warhammer fantasy roleplay game in that instead of playing a lowly medieval fantasy denizen who may or may not climb their way up into power, you are sort of a mid-tier hero right out of the gate. This video for Blackened Earth is the first supplement that I have reviewed for Age of Sigmar Soulbound. Other supplements that have since come out for Soulbound include the first published campaign, Champions of Order, which gives players new good guy character options and expands the setting. Steam and Steel, a supplement that provides vehicle combat rules as well as crafting and alchemy mechanics. Shadows in the Mist is a 6-part campaign set in the huge city of Anvilgard and involves a fair bit of high-stakes political intrigue. The Soulbound Bestiary, which contains about 180 new monsters and creatures, mostly coming from the tabletop wargame Age of Sigmar, of course. And Champions of Death, which gives players the options to create bad guy characters like ghouls, wights, vampires, night haunts, and bone reapers, and expands on some of the villainous elements of the lore. And finally, as of this recording, there is Blackened Earth, where I'm jumping in with this video. This is a 5-part adventure set in and around the industrial city of Greywater Fastness. The 160-page book is pretty straightforward in that it tells you everything about the city and the relevant factions involved in its survival and possible demise. Then the next 5 chapters deliver each of the adventure sessions at about 20 pages each, which are supposed to be played in sequential order and lead to a big climactic series of encounters that determine the fate of the city. In this video, I'm going to cover the description of the city itself and walk through the entire first session and include comments on how I would run it. Obviously, that means there are spoilers for that first session, as well as some mild spoilers for the remaining 4 segments of the campaign. It's always hard to balance reveals versus spoilers in these adventure supplement reviews, so hopefully I can strike a good balance here. The centerpiece of this entire book is the city of Greywater Fastness, which is nestled deep in the realm of Giran, within the Jade Kingdom of Verdia, if that means anything to you. Really, the important features of the location of the city are that 1, it's surrounded by dark, murky jungle and swamps, and 2, it's pretty far removed from civilization except by Realm Gate. The city itself is a military-industrial complex operated by Dwarden, humans, and a smattering of elves. Its sole purpose is to churn out weapons and ammunition of every sort for the forces of order in the pitched war against chaos and destruction and death. But as the story goes, the pollution that it dumps into the adjacent area has angered the Sylvaneth to a boiling point, as well as the rat folk known as Skaven, specifically the clan Skyer, who dwell underneath and around the city, and who want to pillage it for its treasures of weaponry. And it has also cultivated a natural internal presence in the cults of Khorne, as they have emerged from within the city walls. So the overall theme of the adventures and the city itself is industry versus nature, but it actually takes the form of strife and confrontation amongst these various factions, the Sylvaneth, the Skaven, and the Cult of Khorne. There are other factions as well, like the city's leadership itself, which comes in the form of the official Grand Conclave and the unofficial true industrial rulers, the Council of the Forge. Then under them are the industries themselves, as well as the city's armed forces and diasporas of Dwarden and elves. The city's geography is actually pretty important for most of the campaign, and the details of the 12 giant movable cannons atop the city's outer walls are crucial for both GM and players to understand eventually. One other important detail is the fact that the city has entered a pact with Sylvaneth locals that limits it to exactly 1 road in and out of the city walls. You can imagine how this could pose a problem in the event of something bad happening to the city. I won't go through each of the points of interest in this city, but here is a sort of master list of locations. It's worth noting that the look and feel of the city is that of a Magitech industrial hellscape, but one that contains an inner circle where the rich and powerful live in relative cleanliness and luxury. Most folks are just factory workers who ride mechanical conveyor belts to and from work and spend all their earnings at company stores and company-owned taverns. There are a ton of little details that make this a unique and interesting city, though. For example, pack animals and beasts of burden have all been replaced by mechanical analogs called rattle traps. So instead of a horse, you'd see a mechanical construct resembling a horse, and they're powered by the same cyclestone energy that powers the rest of the city. So yeah, the city itself is powered by magical cyclestone, the official realm stone of Giran, that are mined from directly below the city itself, in mines that reach down for miles. And as convenient as that might sound from an energy production standpoint, manufactory and processes used still produce a ton of toxic sludge and air pollution that gets dumped into the area just outside the city called the Ghoul Mere. I wouldn't say that every last one of these city location descriptions are amazing or even all that important or relevant to the adventures that follow, but reading through each one does give you a sense of place and of the culture of the city. Another important feature of the city of Greywater Fastness is that it never sleeps. Factories run 3 shifts 24 hours a day, and there's so much noise everywhere that spells and potions are used to suppress that noise. Outside the city is the Ghoul Mere, a thoroughly hostile and gloomy zone of sucking mud and dark forests. Despite that fact, people from the city have still tried to settle outside the city walls, even in violation of the pact with the Sylvaneth. Beyond that, there are ancient dead elven cities filled with banshees and shades, and colonies of grots who worship giant arachnarok spiders. There's not too much new offered in the way of weapons, gadgets, and gear. For that, you'll probably need to track down the Steam and Steel supplement for this game, but a few of the novel items on offer in this adventure should find their way into the story. First and foremost, Cyclestone, which is extraordinarily valuable and sought after in the city. Then there are the mechanical limbs, known as Rattlebone prosthesis, which are important in painting the picture of this Magitech world. And finally, the Skyfire flares, which will call upon the 12 wall cannons of the city, which are called hands. These cannons can point outward or inward, just so you know. Aside from the campaign of the book itself, there are 9 suggested activities that you can partake in if you have downtime in the city. I thought this was a nice touch, even though the descriptions only run a couple pages. It's a great way to backfill the campaign with activities for the PCs that actually convey the culture of the city. Okay, so like I mentioned, I'm going to walk through this entire first part of the 5-part campaign in this book and throw in my 2 cents on how I would change or improve parts of it here and there. And then sort of hint at what's to come in the other adventures, but not really show those pages or reveal the beats. In Harbinger of Trouble, your party starts in the realm of Akshai, far removed from your destination. The characters are at a realm gate, about to enter it and be transported to Giran, where they will undertake a short trip to the city of Greywater Fastness because apparently there haven't been any deliveries or messages out of the city for 2 full weeks. Since the city is such a vital component to the war efforts among the mortals of the setting, an armed party is sent to investigate, and that includes you. But you're not just marching on foot up the one road, you're traveling in a massive walking fort called a Cog Fort. Each one of these is custom made, and this one is built relatively small and fast, with insect-like legs and a single cannon at the fore. It's still sort of big though, about 3 stories tall. This Cog Fort that you're boarding is called the Harbinger of Trouble. As you board the walking fort, the commander of the mission, Captain Terzo Hines, greets you. He has a rattlebone arm that he keeps fiddling with. He says something like,
"Noticing the arm, are you? Earned it on a trip just like this one we're about to take. I don't plan on earning another one if you're wondering. I run a tight ship, but the Harbinger is just a machine. It can be replaced, but its crew cannot. They come first. You put my crew first and the Harbinger second, and we'll make it to Fastness in one piece, I'll guarantee it."
Or something like that. And then you board the thing and it enters the realm gate that takes you to Giran. So here's how the authors structured this first session. It apparently takes days and days to get from the realm gate that you arrive at to the city. On day 1 of your trip, you're meant to have 2 so-called Giran minor encounters. There's a table here with 36 possibilities, all of which are nothing more than one-sentence descriptions of something you observe. I'd hardly call these encounters, but I guess you're encountering the flavor of the area. Then on day 2, there is a major encounter. The one in this case I would personally term a minor encounter. And then on day 3, there are 2 more Giran minor encounters from the table. And then later that night, a proper major encounter. So as you can tell, this is a pretty traditionally laid out campaign where things are arranged linearly, almost scripted really. If that's your thing, then you're in luck, but if you feel a bit bound up by all of this, or in the case that your players have now watched this video and spoiled the first part, you'll need to put in a little bit of elbow grease to change things up. Anyway, I would probably run this the way it's laid out here. With the first major encounter, Seedfall, players encounter seeds falling from the sky. If they don't pass an athletics test, then they take damage as the seeds aggressively take root in their flesh, somehow ignoring armor. An NPC crew member of the Cog Fort may also fall off and get completely engulfed by the seeds sprouting all over. This is where I would probably do a little something extra. Instead of just some random crew member falling overboard, this should be an NPC that makes a connection with one or more of the PCs somehow. The stronger the connection, the better. Really make their death have a bit of sting to it if you can. After that incident, you're meant to run into 2 more Giran minor encounters, the idea being to slowly ramp up the sense of danger and the unknown. The jungly, life-choked realm here is now clearly not just weird, it's life-threatening. In the big major encounter of the section, Rats on the Hull, it's supposed to be nighttime when the action starts. Characters may or may not hear odd tappings and scrabblings on the top of the Cog Fort, and anyone who does investigate will need to roll a reflexes test in order to save one of the Dwarden guards. So here's one of the early shortcomings I found in the digital version of this book. At the time of this recording, the supplement does come with a few handouts and several really nice maps, but there is no diagram depicting the zones of the Cog Fort. The reason this would be nice is because the vehicle is supposed to have effectively 4 decks that all interconnect, with the bottom engineering deck broken into 3 zones. If you're running this encounter and the party is split up across the 4 levels, a map or diagram of the structure would be extremely helpful. So the intention here of the authors is for you to have most of the fighting take place on the observation deck at the top for at least 3 rounds. After that, the invading Skaven get into the gun deck and eventually the engineering deck, where a huge storm fiend has ripped its way into. Also down there is a Skaven warlock engineer banging his staff on the Emberstone core, which is the Cog Fort's energy source. As this mayhem is happening, the Cog Fort itself is out of control, going at full speed into the thick of the jungle because another Skaven has reached the bridge and is messing with the controls. Anyone who falls off of the Cog Fort at this point is not meant to re-enter the story until the beginning of the next adventure section. It's not entirely clear in the text here when exactly the Skaven engineer manages to rupture the Emberstone core, aside from him hitting it 3 times, but this is a great opportunity to stretch things out a bit with a timer and really amp up the tension. As the GM, you can just tell the players that the core will explode in 5 or 6 rounds or whatever, and that will impose some well-defined urgency on the situation. According to the scenario, the Cog Fort needs to be rendered unrepairable no matter what, but it would be nice to give players some agency here on how exactly it gets abandoned. If I were to run the scenario, I would present several ways in which the Cog Fort could be destroyed, and if the players could prevent all paths to its destruction, it still needs to be abandoned, but they could earn some kind of narrative boon awarded later in the campaign. As far as how they could stymie the vehicle's destruction, is 1, PCs could stop the engineer from destroying the core within a certain number of rounds, then in any order, defeat the Storm Fiend and prevent it from destroying the engineering deck, as well as clear the bridge of Skaven to gain control. Unfortunately, the players do have to abandon the Cog Fort at some point in order for the next adventure segment to make sense, so in the event that they win back the vehicle, there are still endless hordes of Skaven encroaching that would hopefully make the point known that they have to abandon. No matter what the reason, Captain Hines orders for a full and messy retreat into the jungle, and your final glimpse back at the Cog Fort shows a Skaven leader screeching victoriously atop the machine, one who you might run into again. The next adventures put you on a multi-day trek through the jungles of Goupil, and eventually you get into the city of Greywater Fastness, then back out, then back in again. And then the finale has players juggling the movements of all these different factions that I mentioned at the start of the video. Ratmen, angry elves, bloodthirsty Khorne cultists, Sylvaneth, all pretty much wanting to control or destroy the city. Which of course begs the question, why should the PCs at your table want to save the city in the first place? It's just assumed that they are supporters of the god Sigmar and his war efforts and will do what it takes to save this blight on nature. I think the most interesting outcome is if players deviate from this underlying script in some way. But then as GM, you would have to have the wherewithal and the talent to go off script as well. As much as I'm uncomfortable with the notion of preordained events unfolding no matter what players do, I am impressed by the quality and the sharpness of the presentation in this book of both the city and the adventures in this book. The city could have occupied twice as many pages, but they didn't go overboard with the details. And the adventures don't seem overindulgent either, which is honestly a feature I see in a lot of published adventures. But with regards to the linear railroadism, this is a very common and traditional way of presenting adventures, and a lot of people are okay with it. So oddly, as a GM, you really don't want your players buying or reading this book, but you do want them to be into Soulbound and into the rules and the lore, just not buying these adventure supplements. I'd love to hear how you handle traditional published adventures in terms of spoilers and in terms of the railroadism that they often present themselves with. And if you'd like to keep this channel going, please consider joining my Patreon. All the links are below. Thanks for watching. See ya.